Hi. Hello. I welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's amazing how many folks showed up tonight. We're very, very pleased to introduce Scott Weidenthal, who's a native Pennsylvania son, grew up in Schuylkill County, and Scott is a widely published author. Got his start as a newspaperman, covering, he told me, some township news, so he's kind of come full circle.
Somebody did something wrong.
So has written widely, both in journals, had a long-running column in the Philadelphia Inquirer on natural history, but also as a freelance writer, both in natural history. Had a Pulitzer Prize finalist book on migration, has written extensively also in cultural history, whether it was the history of ornithology in his book Of a Feather, or the history of pioneer days in our country and the clash and collaboration between two different cultures. And Scott is also an established researcher in ornithology. Most of his work has to do with migration, and much of that to do with owl migration, which brings us here tonight. His newest book is the Peterson Reference Guide to Owls, and we'll be talking a lot about owls tonight, but I just want to have you join me in welcoming Scott. My name is Mark Fallon, if I didn't mention that. I'm the senior naturalist at Briar, and I've been there about 14 years. And I also want to mention our sponsor tonight, Jenkinstown Lyceum, who made this whole event possible. So thanks to them as well. And just a little bit about the format tonight. We're going to be somewhat informal. Scott and I kind of decided it's a little more dynamic to have a conversation rather than just, do a slideshow. Of course, he does have some really cool, amazing things to show us, but we're going to start just kind of discussing and, taking some questions, and we'll lead on from there.
I've never done theater in a round before. If anybody starts with spitballs, let me know. How is everybody this evening? Is this on? No. No? No? Yeah, I think it is.
You have to be
Maybe you just need a
really close.
Need to be close. Is that better? Yes. Okay. Well, by the way, I'm also impressed by the number of owl-themed garments in the crowd this evening. And I'm sitting up here. I ended up wearing my Hawk Mountain vest with a diurnal raptor on, so don't hold that against me.
So one of the first questions I had for Scott really had to do with what kind of a book this is. Most of us are familiar with like a pocket field guide, but if you look at the cover of this book, it's a reference guide. So it's very, very different from, say, a pocket field guide on birds or trees or something like that. And if you look through the pages, the amount of information about every species is just unbelievable. We do have our screech owl here tonight, and she'll be coming out for a show later, but I just wanted to mention or read some of the things that Scott includes that just makes this book, to me, unique. And here's a sentence. The screech owl's call has always carried a tinge of melancholy. Thoreau called it a most solemn graveyard ditty, the mutual consolations of suicide lovers. How many reference guides do you have on natural history that you can read a sentence like that? It's just amazing.
Well, thank you. And it's obviously not a field guide. You would have to have an awfully big pocket to stick that book in. And in fact, of course, most of you are familiar with Roger Tory Peterson and the fact that Peterson. Yeah, let me just Is that better? Oh gosh, yeah. Let's, let me just see if we pull this plug out, perhaps. Or we can let the guy who actually knows what he's doing see what the problem is. Yeah, we'll just use this for a second. So it's, Roger Tory Peterson, of course, sort of invented the modern field guide in 1934, and the idea was to give you just enough information that you can carry it around in your pocket and identify a bird. But there's a whole lot more to any species, be it a bird or an animal or a plant or whatever, than what you need for identification. And so Houghton Mifflin, which has been publishing the Peterson Field Guides since the 1930s, started the Reference Guide series a few years ago. And the idea was to be able to drill down in much more detail on certain groups of birds or animals. They've done them on mammal behavior and bird molt and a bunch of other things. And as soon as I heard that Houghton Mifflin was going to start this series, I thought I've got the perfect group of birds, because everybody is interested in owls, and yet we have a lot of misconceptions about owls. And as I was talking to Mark beforehand, there's still a tremendous amount we don't know about even the most common species. This eastern screech owl that you're going to see a little bit later has this enormous range. They're found from the Atlantic seaboard to the fringes of the Rocky Mountains, and from like Winnipeg up in the edge of the subarctic in Canada all the way down to the lower Rio Grande Valley in Texas. And yet the hardest thing about writing this book was coming up with new and different ways of saying we don't know, not enough information, very little known, poorly studied, and certainly that's the case for some of these rare tropical species. Let's see if that works.
Thanks.
Tell you what, let's.
Where is the
much better
P now?
Yes, I know. But even for the most common and widespread ones, like great horned owls and eastern screech owls and barred owls, there's just huge chunks of their ecology and their life history that we know nothing about, and that's because they're nocturnal and we're diurnal. And I am here to tell you, as somebody who spent 20 years studying one particular kind of owl, you have to have a very high tolerance for sleep deprivation to learn anything about owls. And I was banding last night until 2 o'clock in the morning, so if I doze off at some point, Mark's supposed to give me a little nudge.
And I guess, that's feeds into the dedication for the book for your wife. I guess you also have to have an understanding spouse.
My dear wife, Amy, had no idea that's not true. She did know what she was getting into, because before we even met, she was volunteering at a saw-whet owl banding research station down in Maryland, where she was working for Maryland Audubon. So she kind of knew what she was getting into, but I don't know that she knew she was dropping into the deep end of the pool quite to the same extent. I come home in the middle of the night at this time of the year, and it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'm freezing because I've been out. We got heat in our banding station this year for the first time in 20 years, so maybe this won't be the case. But in the past, I'd come home freezing cold and crawl into bed, and she spoons up next to me, even though I must be like an icicle. That is love. That is love. I'm not absolutely sure I'd do that for her if the situation were reversed.
So tell me why you wanted to include not just owls from North America, but also the Caribbean.
Well, and first of all, it's North America, including Mexico, which we shouldn't even have to say, because North America goes all the way down to the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in southern Mexico. And so there's a whole bunch of species of owls that don't come north of the Mexican border that are just mysterious, cool birds, like Stygian owl, which is, if you for the birders in the audience, it's like a long-eared owl. Think of a skinny great horned owl, but that you had dipped in soot and given orange contact lenses to. It's their eyes are like the color of your Syracuse sweatshirt over there, and there's this dark and we know virtually nothing about them. And they're found in the tropics from Mexico south and also in the Caribbean. And there's a bunch of species that are found only in the Caribbean, like the bare-legged owl in Cuba, which nobody can even figure out what genus it belongs in, how taxonomically it fits in with all of these other owls. And frankly, the owls, particularly in the Caribbean, really still suffer dramatically from human persecution because of, we've got this long history as a species of being slightly freaked out by owls and associating them with witches and Halloween and spooky things and ghosts. And in parts of the Caribbean, on islands like Jamaica, one of the leading causes of mortality among owls is that people kill them because they think they're associated with witchcraft. Literally still today. Conservationists in places like the Dominican Republic and Jamaica have had to mount public education campaigns to convince people that owls are not witches, they do not suck the blood of your babies, and you shouldn't stone them to death when you find them. But we still think a lot of things are bad luck and bad omens, and this time of the year in particular. It's still pretty rough being an owl in many parts of the world.
And I've heard those kind of sort of old wives' tales about, particularly about barn owls. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, oh God, yes. So I think if I had $1 for every ghost story that got its start with a barn owl, I could probably stop writing books about owls, frankly. So imagine it's Halloween, and you've taken on a dare to go into the haunted house down at the end of the street, the rickety old ramshackle place with the broken windows, and you screw up your courage, and let's say maybe you're a teenager, because that's the sort of thing I did when I was a teenager. And so you're creeping through this house, and all of your nerves are jangling out of fear and anticipation, and you're creaking up the steps, and you get to the top stair, and you suddenly hear this thing that sounds like, and you look up, and this white thing is flying silently past your head. I can guarantee you the first thing you're going to think is not, oh, well, I believe that's a barn owl. That's Tyto alba praticola. No, one part of your brain is going to be screaming for your mommy, and the other part of your brain is going to be sending your body hurtling out. But barn owls live in old structures, dilapidated houses, church steeples, old barns. Originally they nested in hollow trees and occasionally in cliff ledges and things like that. But for as long as we've been building buildings, barn owls have been moving into them and making these bizarre sounds. That was a mild imitation of what a barn owl sounds like. It sounds like a combination of air escaping from a monster truck tire crossed with the sound of demon spawn from the pit of hell. It's just raises the hackle on anybody's neck. Years and years ago, I used to do a lot of wildlife rehab with injured hawks and owls, and I'd gotten a barn owl that had suffered rodenticide poisoning. It was partially paralyzed, and I had to force feed it, and it didn't like that, and so the whole time I was force feeding it in this outdoor flight enclosure, it was really loudly. And my nearest neighbor, who lived hundreds of yards away through the woods, as I was finishing, pulled up in the driveway, rolled her window down, and said, "Were you murdering someone, or did you get a new bird?" It does not sound. But here's the thing about owls. Owls don't. Some owls hoot, but most owls don't hoot. Some of them toot. Northern saw-whet owls, which I've been studying for 20 years, the male call sounds just like a garbage truck backing up. It's this methodical, mechanical. And we play that at 80 decibels on a digital amplifier system at night on a loop to lure the birds into our mist nets. And I tell you, after a couple of hours of listening to that, it induces psychotic visions. You start hearing voices. But some owls toot, they hoot, they whinny, they whine, they bark, they meow, they growl, they roar. It's just, if an owl can make a weird sound that will freak you out, somebody somewhere does that. I tell my banding crew, because we're not necessarily used to being in the woods late at night, and you hear these weird things, and I tell them, if you hear a sound that sounds like you want to cry for your mommy, it was an owl.
So you mentioned earlier that owls face these particular conservation problems in some other cultures, but you also mentioned very briefly one of the conservation problems in our culture with rodenticides. And I just wanted to also ask you a little bit about what can people do to help owls in their own backyard?
Well, there's a couple of things, and actually, you've really hit on one of the emerging problems for birds of prey in general, not just owls, but also hawks and falcons and any predatory bird. The new rodenticides, the new rat poisons that have come on the market in the last 5 to 10 years, what are known as second-generation anticoagulants, are really, really dangerous for wildlife. So when you put rat or mouse poison out, yes, it kills the mouse, but what usually happens is that mouse heads outside of the building because it's looking for water, because it's bleeding to death internally. And these poisons are really potent secondary and even tertiary poisons, which means that the mouse dies, and if something eats the mouse, either dead or while it's dying, it will poison that animal, and if something eats that carcass, it may poison that. So that's secondary and tertiary. And one of the things that scientists are increasingly finding with owls and other raptors is that even if the rodenticide doesn't kill them outright, it has exactly the same effect on the birds that warfarin has on us. I would imagine there are probably some folks in the room here tonight who take warfarin on a regular basis as a blood thinner. And if you're giving these uncontrolled doses, sublethal, but still doses to these birds, what happens is it thins their blood as well. And if they cut themselves, or if they're bitten by their prey, because a lot of these animals are feeding on animals that have sharp teeth, that bite, they may bleed to death from that. And so this is a real problem. Now the EPA just banned some of the most potent second generation anticoagulants for home use, but they're still being used professionally by exterminators, and it's a real problem. We're seeing in places, especially in more suburban and urban areas where there's lots of rodenticide being used, virtually every raptor is carrying some degree of anticoagulant in its bloodstream. They're just all being exposed to it to some degree.
And I already had one question earlier tonight about making nesting boxes or nesting platforms for owls.
Right. So, yes, I'm sorry. Thank you for gently steering me back on the what can you do part. Because, no species of owl makes its own nest with burrowing owls in some places will dig their own burrow, but every other owl is dependent either on a natural cavity in a tree, like screech owls nest in tree cavities, saw-whet owls nest in tree cavities, barred owls, even though they're quite big, or like great horned owls, they take over the nests of other birds like crows or hawks or ravens. So for most of the small owls, like the screech owl we're going to see, the limiting factor for these birds is that there just aren't that many trees out there with natural holes in them. Actually, suburban areas are better for these cavity nesting owls because most older suburban neighborhoods have lots of big shade trees. And in fact, my colleague Rob Beauregard at the Academy of Natural Sciences studied barred owls in North Carolina for years, and he found that barred owls did much better in suburban areas in North Carolina than in the country because it's a big owl, they need big holes in trees, and there's lots of big old shade trees in suburban backyards and urban parks and places like that. Mm-hmm. So if you want to help owls, one of the easiest things to do is put up nest boxes. And they can be relatively small for screech owls, the same size box you'd put up for a kestrel, so about that big with about a 3-inch entrance diameter hole. Will work really well for a screech owl. For a barred owl, you need something a little bit bigger, more like a wood duck box size. But here's the thing about owls. Each pair of owls that nests in cavities needs at least 5 cavities in its neighborhood, in its territory. It needs a primary nest site, a secondary alternate nest site, a male roost site, and a female roost site because they have separate bedrooms. It's a mature relationship. And they need a food cache site, a place where the male can bring excess food and drop it off there inside a hollow tree. Well, the problem is in most areas there just aren't that many hollow trees with old woodpecker holes. So don't just put up one nest box, put up several. Even if it's just in a fairly small backyard, if you've got woods there, put 2 or 3 nest boxes up, and that may be enough to tip it over. That's the case with screech owls, barred owls. if you've got a place in South Texas where endangered ferruginous pygmy owls nest, same thing with them. Northern saw-whet owls up north, they all need multiple cavities in their territory. So just putting up a couple of nest boxes can really make a huge difference.
Cool. So I'd love to have you tell us a little bit more about screech owls and bring Scarlett out here.
Yeah, let's do that. And so I'm about to get up. They used to tell you never work with children or animals. I'm about to get upstaged here by an animal. But so the eastern screech owl is one of the most common owls in North America. Up until the 1970s, we just talked about the screech owl, kind of from coast to coast. But in 1973, they were split into two different species, two different vocalizations, and the intergrade zone where the overlap zone where the two meet is in the western plains. The eastern screech owl is a bird of for the most part hardwood forests, and they come in several different flavors. They come in different color morphs. This is the chocolate flavor. They come in red morphs or gray morphs. And when I was a kid, we used to call them phases, like a red-phased screech owl. But phase suggests something that changes, and these birds will stay this color the rest of their life. So you have the gray and the brown morph birds, like scarlet, but then the red morph birds are the color of a new brick. They are this bright reddish orange color, and it's not connected to age. They don't change color as they get older. It's not connected to sex. Within the same nest, you can have red and brown and gray chicks, all from the same parents. What's interesting, though, is it is connected in part to geography and in part to habitat. The red morph birds are more common farther south in the bird's range. The farther south you go, the higher the prevalence of the red morph birds. They're found in warmer, more humid environments, and they tend to be found in more predominantly hardwood environments. Whereas as you get further north in the bird's range, and eastern screech owls range about as far north as southern Maine, southern Ontario. The farther north you go, the more gray morph birds you find. They tend to be found in cooler environments and also in forests that have a higher conifer component, more conifer trees. And for a long time, scientists assumed that this must be some kind of camouflage, that these gray morph birds must, there were all these sort of just so stories about how the gray birds blended in with the cool gray shadows of a conifer forest. And well, it turns out if you look at the metabolism of the gray birds morph birds have a more efficient metabolism at low temperatures. They're able to maintain their high body temperature, because their average body temperature is about 104 degrees. They can maintain that body temperature more efficiently in colder weather than the red morph birds. And these gray morph birds, there's a number of species where you see that red-gray split between north and south. Ruffed grouse have the same thing. Across most of the ruffed grouse's range here in Pennsylvania and point south, they're sort of they're rusty brown. You get up into Maine, they talk about silver grouse. It's a gray morph. Even whippoorwills. And all of these birds, the gray morph birds have a more efficient metabolism. But there's a trade-off, because the gene that controls for metabolism also apparently controls for the color. The color is probably an accident. It's probably just an accidental secondary expression of this gene for metabolism. But they pay a price, because the gray morph birds have less sensitive hearing at certain high frequency ranges where the red morph birds can hear really well. So there's a trade-off there. Apparently it is better, if you're a screech owl, to be slightly deaf but not freeze to death. And with a lot of owls are polymorphic, where they have different color morphs. And in all of those polymorphic owls, the closer you get to the equator, the further south you go, the more prevalent that red morph is, and the farther north you go, the more prevalent the gray morph. And they haven't tested some of the other owls like pygmy owls, but that they probably benefit from that same metabolic advantage. So, somebody had a question, I think. Yes.
Yeah, with the nest boxes, Since they have a big hole, how do you keep the squirrels out of it?
Well, partly you count on the fact that it's a predator taking over the nest box from the squirrel, but frankly, there's not much you can do about that. It's you pays you money, you takes your chances. There's really no way. You're right. I mean, a 3-inch entrance for a screech owl, a squirrel can fit in there easily, and you may just be providing room for the squirrel. Yes.
When somebody asks a question, could you either have them come to the microphone or
I'll repeat it. Did everybody hear that question? If you put up a nest box with a large entrance hole, how do you keep squirrels out? Thank you for the reminder. I should have done that. So, yes.
There's a question in the back behind you.
Okay. We'll take this one.
Okay.
You were talking about putting multiple boxes out.
Mhm.
How far apart should you space them?
They don't have to be very far apart. How far apart should you put these boxes if you're putting up multiple nest boxes? They can be on adjacent trees. They don't have to be real far apart. So if you've got sort of an average-sized backyard, just kind of scatter them around in there. So,
Yeah, getting back to the morphs, you said at one point that there could be a red and a gray and a brown in one litter. If that's the case, then the potentiality for producing all these different morphs must be widely distributed over the entire population.
it is. And I should have made, so did everybody hear that question? Okay, so if you have red and gray and brown morphs all in the same clutch, then the genes for that must be spread evenly through the population. And actually, that's not true. If you go down to a place like Florida, every bird in that clutch is going to be red morph because 85 or 90% of the population is red morph. In this area, I can't speak to Abington. I live up in Schuylkill County. We're about 60% red morph screech owls up there. And if you get up into, say, the Adirondacks or the Catskills, it's probably about 30% or so. It drops off pretty dramatically. By the way, I think probably the single coolest fact about screech owls that I know, and this is one of the single coolest facts about any owl that I know, is that these guys practice biological pest control. There's a researcher named Fred Gelbach at Texas A&M, and Dr. Gelbach has been studying screech owls in Austin, Texas for decades. And he puts up nest boxes and goes in, bans the chicks. And if you've never opened up a nest box that owls have been using, I'll try to convey the olfactory experience because these are birds with very poor personal hygiene. The chicks defecate in the box. Mom and dad are bringing in, in the case of screech owls, small mammals like mice. They're bringing in small reptiles and amphibians, big insects. The chicks eat this. Bits and pieces go everywhere. They eat kind of everything: fur, feathers, bones, meat, entrails, the whole bit. And then they regurgitate this pellet of non-digestible, the feathers and the fur and the bones all wrapped up in a pellet that comes out that eventually forms this thick felted layer in the bottom of the box, and it smells just god-awful. And you can imagine in the summertime in Austin, Texas, how that smells, and you can imagine what a fertile breeding ground for insects that is. Well, Dr. Gelbach goes into these boxes, and he's pulling these birds out, and one of the things that he kept finding when he was cleaning out his nest boxes were live blind snakes. Now, a blind snake, it's about that long. It looks like a glorified worm. It's a blind. It is a snake. It is blind. It is pink, and it burrows underground and it feeds on insects and worms and larvae and things. And what Dr. Gelbach has documented is that screech owls in Austin, Texas, seek out these blind snakes, capture them alive without hurting them, and bring them back to the nest and release them in the nest box, and they burrow down into this felted layer and they feed on the larvae of blood-sucking flies that would otherwise, in some cases, kill the chicks. And the survival rate, the fledging rate for chicks in these boxes with blind snakes is dramatically higher than it is in boxes without. Now, how they figured that out, I do not begin to know. For years I've been telling people, forget what you heard about the wise old owl. Owls do not rank particularly high on the scale of avian intelligence compared to parrots or crows or ravens or jays, but that is one smart bird. And, you know, I don't want to suggest that they're sitting there necessarily going, oh, blind snake, wonder how that would work at home. You know, it's the sort of thing that you know, across the course of evolution, they stumbled across this. You know, they eat small reptiles and amphibians, and I'm sure the first time they were bringing blind snakes back to their nest cavity in some old hollow tree, God knows how many thousands of years ago, it was as food, but it got loose in there, and you know, for whatever reason, that behavior has carried over. We're not aware of screech owls doing that anywhere else in their range. But also, to get back to something Mark and I were talking about before the program started, one of the most abundant, widespread birds in North America, one of the most widely studied owls in North America, because it's found everywhere, and yet widely studied. Dr. Gelbach's studies in Austin, Texas, and one study in the 1970s in Ohio are the only year-round studies of the ecology of eastern screech owls that have been done anywhere. We really still know bupkis about even the most common, abundant, widespread birds.
So anyone under 20 in the room who wants a job.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm not saying it pays well, but but hey, great sleep deprivation, and you have to get routine tetanus shots, and you get your fingers stuck full of little sharp talons from time to time. It's actually pretty cool.
So one thing I'd like to interpret is this is called a screech owl, but you did the screech owl before, right? The barn owl is really the screecher.
It really is. It really is. So yeah,
Why is it called a screech owl?
I've never really known. I mean, I actually my personal feeling is the juvenile call, the food begging call of a young screech owl is this horrible grating. It is kind of a screech. And in late summer, when the juveniles have left the nest, and there may be 5 or 6 of them, it's a fairly large clutch, and they're all going, this, I can't even do it. I'll lose my voice. It's this horrible, horrible sound. It is a sound evolutionarily designed to be so annoying that the parent owl will stuff a dead mouse in that chick's mouth just to shut it up. So I think that may be where screech owl came from, because if we were if we were naming this owl based on its call, it would be the whinnying owl. And in fact, that's one of the old folk names for it, was the whinnying owl, the hoarse whinny owl, the shivering owl, because and unlike people like my good friend Pete Dunn, who can do a screech owl imitation, I can only do a screech owl imitation when I have a bad sinus infection with a lot of phlegm. Kind of tip your head back and whistle, but it's a descending whinny, and then they'll also give a monotone. And the descending whinny call is a territorial call, and the monotone call is a pair communication call. Both members of the pair will do it, males and females both. But it's a spooky sound if you don't know what it is, and it doesn't sound anything like what most people think an owl sounds like.
I'm going to put her back.
She's so cute, though.
So what was the first thing you guys noticed about that owl?
Little.
The eyes, yeah. She's got enormous eyes, and of course that's one of the hallmarks of owls in general. If your eyes proportionally were as large in your head as Scarlett's eyes are in her head, you would have eyes the size of grapefruit, and people would make fun of you. But that's and you only see part of the eye. The eye is the emergent part of the eye is big, but if you open up the owl's head and look at the back of the eye, it's encased in this bony ring called a sclerotic ring. It's quite long, and it kind of flares out at the back of the eye, at the retina. And it's huge. And just like with windows, the bigger the eye, the bigger the window, the more light it lets in. So that's the owl's primary adaptation for being able to function at night. Now, owls can see pretty well at night, but they cannot see as well at night as many nocturnal mammals. If you find an owl at night and you shine a light in its eyes, you'll get a little bit of a hint of a reflection, but it's not like when the deer 100 yards away gets hit with your headlight beams and you see that brilliant glow. Nocturnal mammals like deer and raccoons and cats have something called a tapetum lucidum at the back of the eye. It's this reflective layer on the back of the retina, so that light comes into the eye and then bounces around in there, and it allows the optic nerve to gather more light. Owls don't have that. And so most owls are primarily active within an hour or two after sunset or before daybreak, especially if it's a moonless period like we have right now where there's not a lot of moonlight. Now, they can see way better at night than we can, but they can't see, for example, in complete darkness. In fact, for a lot of owls, they're using their eyes when they're hunting, but they're particularly using their ears. Owls have really extraordinary hearing. And the other thing that people notice about owl when you see it, what makes an owl just so self-evidently an owl, is that round face, what's known as the facial disc on either side of the eye. And if you lift the feathers away, you'll see it underneath the facial disc are these two muscular flaps. And at the base of the muscular flaps is a hole in the head. Those little ear tufts on the top of Scarlet's head are just feathers. They're just there for camouflage. They have no role at all in hearing. Her ears are on the side of her head, and the facial disc forms basically like two parabolic reflectors, and it functions just exactly like my hands are right now. I'm hard of hearing, and when I'm having trouble hearing something, I put my hands up like this. The facial disc gathers sound waves, directs them into the ear opening. The feathers that cover the facial disc are acoustically transparent. Sound waves go right through them. They're very kind of open, woven mesh. Doesn't block the sound waves. And then the feathers around the rim of the facial disc are acoustically opaque, and they help funnel sound in. And the owl can actually shift the shape of those muscular flaps that are hidden under the feathers to pick up, the little nuances of sound. Now, birds like the screech owl, which, as I said, screech owls probably are most active, within a couple of hours of sunset, when there's still a lot of, not to our eyes, but still a lot of light available in the sky. Really highly nocturnal owls, though, species like the northern saw-whet owl and the great gray owl and the boreal owl, have wildly asymmetrical ear openings in their skull. You are a bilaterally symmetrical organism. If I cut you, not that I would, because you seem like a very nice person. If I cut you down the middle, each half is basically the same, including our ears. But if I had a northern saw-whet owl here, one of its ears is high on the head and faces up, and the other one is low on the head and faces down. It's like these two curving slits on the skull. And great gray owls, their skulls look like somebody partially melted them and then squished them. It's kind of grotesque. But what that does is it means that sound is hitting one ear opening, a nanosecond of a nanosecond at a different time than the other ear opening. And it allows the bird to really very precisely locate extremely high-frequency, quiet sound waves, very quiet, high-frequency sound waves of the kind that, for example, mice make when they're moving, and to do it in both a horizontal and a vertical axis without moving their head. One of the things you'll see with a lot of owls is they'll do this head bob. I see that when I'm trying to catch a snowy owl and I've got a trap set and the snowy owl's interested, it sort of does this head bob. And what it's doing is it's triangulating the distance to the prey visually, but it's also doing it aurally. It's also doing it with its ears. A northern saw-whet owl doesn't have to do that. It can sit there perfectly still without giving away its position to a mouse and know, even in almost complete darkness, exactly where that mouse is and drop in and grab it. Back in the 1960s, there was a scientist named Roger Payne, and Dr. Payne went on to his greatest fame working with whales, working with southern right whales in South America. But he was a grad student, and he was tasked with trying to figure out whether barn owls find their prey in the dark by using their sense of hearing or perhaps their vision. Like perhaps scientists thought at the time that owls might be able to see in the infrared zone, and they might be able to see the body heat from a mouse, because he knew if you put a barn owl in a light, tight room and released a mouse in there, it'll catch the mouse. So he thought about this for quite a while, and he came up with some really elaborate ways to try to test this, to try to see if they had infrared vision, and then he had an aha moment, and he realized, no, there's a very simple way of doing this. He took a barn owl, took a mouse, put the barn owl and mouse in a light, tight room, waited to see what happened. Boom, barn owl caught the mouse. Then he took the next mouse, and he tied about a foot-long piece of string to its tail and a ball of paper at the end of the string and released it in the room, and boom, the owl caught the paper every time. I suspect his graduate advisor might have been a little disappointed at how simple the experiment was, but it proved that the owl was not using infrared vision; it was using its ears to find that mouse.
So we've been talking a little bit about owl senses, and so much concentrated on the eyes and the ears.
Yeah.
And what about the smell? Because I know most of them, you talked about the fetid smell from inside that box.
Yeah.
Don't have much of a sense of smell. Or
So far as we know, and that's always been the thing about birds is we think that most birds have little or no sense of smell. The olfactory region of the brain is not well developed in most birds, and that's certainly the case with owls. On the other hand, the more we look at olfactory sense in birds, the more we discover that they actually do have, including some birds that don't appear to have significant olfactory lobe in the brain, they certainly seem to be responding to smells. So I suspect owls don't have much of a sense of smell, but I wouldn't want to bet the farm on it. Back in the days when I used to do raptor rehabilitation, you could always tell, somebody would come to the house and they'd get out and they'd have a box, and if the wind was right, you'd go, oh, that's a great horned owl, because I can smell the skunk from here. Great horned owls love to eat skunks. They're slow-moving, slightly stupid black and white protein packets. And so...
like a runway.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, we're coming right in. And they don't, so adult great horned owls often smell like skunks because, you grab a skunk and kill it with your feet, it's going to spray you. And so that's always been held up as an example of how owls have no sense of smell, because why otherwise would you eat? I suspect to them, skunk just smells like dinner. But the fact is we don't really know.
Okay. And
Little information,
Yeah.
poorly understood.
You were also talking about the discs of feathers around their eyes and how that focuses sound. Of course, as kids, those discs turn into glasses in all the storybooks,
Yes.
and we all know about the wise old owl.
And
the triple
obviously,
owl.
anyone wearing eyeglasses must be
Right.
highly intelligent.
Exactly. But what about intelligence in owls?
Well, and that's, I'm always a little nervous about talking about this because, as I said before, on the scale of avian intelligence, where African gray parrots and ravens, Bernd Heinrich, who studied ravens for years, has been able to experimentally show that a raven can reason at about the same rate as a 5-year-old human child. I know some pretty smart 5-year-olds. Owls are not at that level, at least the way we score intelligence. What they are is extremely good at being owls. And when you see things like, the screech owls bringing these blind snakes back to their nests, you got to wonder, maybe there's something going on there that we're not giving them credit for. But for the most part, the wise old owl thing comes from, as you say, their physical appearance. They look like us, right? They've got round heads and big forward-facing eyes, so they look vaguely human. And we're smart, so obviously they would be. The little owl, which is a Eurasian relative of our burrowing owl, was associated with the goddess Athena, the goddess of wisdom. And little owls often nest in and around human buildings in the old world. So I think that just has sort of cascaded down through the millennia. But it's there's not a lot of natural history experimental evidence to suggest that owls are any brighter or less bright than most other birds, and that they're not the university professors that corvids and parrots are.
So tell me what your favorite owl was to write about in here, if you have one.
Oh, there's a Sophie's choice. All right, so I've been working with saw-whet owls now for 20 years, and for those of you who do not know what a northern saw-whet owl is, it's the cutest freaking animal on the face of the earth. They're about the size of a soda can. They've got a a huge, in fact, hold on, just a second. That's a northern saw. Yeah, and that's always the reaction we get. That's one that we captured for banding. We're holding it in what's called a bander's grip. It's a very safe way of holding the bird. Its neck is literally thinner than a pencil. So yeah, these are just cosmically cute birds. I've been studying saw-whet owl since 1997. Our banding project, based out of the Ned Smith Center for Nature and Art up in Dauphin County, we've banded somewhere between 10 and 11,000 of these birds. I was banding them last night. We caught 16 last night. I'm telling you, it never gets old. They're just an incredibly engaging animal. When we started working with the species in the mid-'90s, saw-whet owls were considered so rare in Pennsylvania that they were the symbol of the state's Wild Resource Conservation Fund. That's why the saw-whet owl is on the conservation license plate. And they were listed as a candidate species for the state's threatened and endangered species list because birders can go a lifetime without seeing a northern saw-whet owl. You know, we caught 4,000 of them in 2012. It turns out they're incredibly common, and at this time of the year, they're migrating down from the boreal forests of Canada. I can guarantee you right now, as we sit here tonight, there are saw-whet owls flying over Abington. And if we found a little patch of woods somewhere around here, if we went out to Briar Bush and put up nets down behind the Nature Center and turned on an audio lure playing that, garbage truck backing up sound, that hopefully before the neighbors called the cops, we would probably catch saw-whet owls. But, we still know very little about them. We've used radio telemetry over the years. We use geolocation. We've used forward-looking infrared video cameras at night to try to track them at night. We've used radar, and yet there's still so much we don't know about them. If there's one owl I have that's a particular favorite, it's got to be that one. But I have to tell you, I've been faithful to saw-whet owls for a very long time, and then 3 years ago I kind of cheated and had a continuing fling with snowy owls, and that's a whole different, it's like a quantum leap difference. So.
I understand the snowy owl has 3D hearing that can pick a field mice from 3 feet deep snow. And they can pick that mouse up from 3 feet under snow.
So the question is, do snowy owls have the kind of hearing that would allow them to pick up a field mouse under 3 feet of snow? Possibly. Snowy owls actually are much more sight-focused birds, but great gray owls, the ones with the weird skewed head, definitely can do that. And in fact, I knew the authorities were going to come for me. Great gray owls, one of the reasons they have such incredibly good hearing is because they plunge dive for prey in extremely deep snow. This is a big bird. I mean, a great gray owl stands about that tall, has about a 5-foot wingspan, and they will plunge completely under the snow to catch a mouse that's down there. And so they'll sit there with this enormous facial disc facing down and listening and listening and listening, boom, down in. So, but snowy owls can hear very well, don't get me wrong. And in fact, my good friend Norman Smith at Massachusetts Audubon, who's been studying snowy owls for 35 years now at Logan Airport, has some amazing stories about the abilities of snowy owls, not just to hear, but also to discriminate quiet sounds in a noisy environment. Norman has on many occasions been sitting out on the tarmac at Logan Airport. He's actually permitted by the airport to go out and trap snowy owls there and move them away from the airport so they don't collide with planes. And he catches them in a big spring-loaded bow net. And the starling's finally gone. He had a starling that was 11 years old that he used for 11 years as a lure bird to catch these snowy owls. It was balls.
Torturous.
I mean, it had just gone. I mean, that 11 years old is Methuselah for a starling. And he told me that he'd set his bow net down with the starling, and there'd be a snowy owl 100 yards away with its back to him, sitting on a taxiway light at the airport with a 747 idling its engines right next to the owl. And, you can barely hear yourself think under those circumstances. And then the starling, he'd see the starling's mouth open because it gave a call. And, he's only 50 or 60 feet away. He can't hear the starling, but that owl's head snaps around and boom, right into the starling. And there's no experimental evidence for this that I know of. But Norman believes that the snowy owl can somehow filter out all the extraneous sound from the jet and just listen for the frequencies where prey would be. How it would do that physically, I don't know. But he's seen this happen so many times that he's convinced that they must have the ability to do that. So, in the back, yeah.
Tell them about the project with the snowy owls and the website where they can.
I did not plant her in the audience. So,
I watched it all winter.
right. So here, this has been the coolest thing I think that I've ever been involved in. In the winter of 2013-2014. We experienced the largest invasion of snowy owls in the East since at least the 1920s, possibly as far back as the 1890s. And I'll just share. So this is a map from Cornell Lab of Ornithology's eBird project, where people upload every month millions of birding checklists. It's a great way of tracking the movements and abundance of birds. This is a normal winter in the Northeast for snowy owls. You get a couple dozen to maybe 100 snowy owls around the Great Lakes and on the Northeast coast. This was January of 2013. That's what December of 2013 looked like. They just came down by the thousands from the Arctic. And the reason for that is that right there. That's a snowy owl nest in the summer of 2013 in northern Canada up on the Ungava Peninsula. There are three snowy owl eggs and one newly hatched chick in the middle of the nest, and feel free to count, that's 78 dead lemmings around the nest. This is one enthusiastic male, right? The chicks haven't really been hatched yet, and he's bringing in the food. But, so there's a couple things going on here. First of all, lemming populations are cyclical, right? They boom and bust and boom and bust. And periodically they boom at just historic levels. And that summer in northern Ungava Peninsula in the subarctic of Canada, they had more lemmings than they've had in 50 or 60 years. And somehow the snowy owls from across the eastern and central Canadian Arctic knew this. We don't know how. A friend of mine who studies snowy owls speculates that they can smell them, and he's not kidding. But they gathered there in large numbers, and instead of just laying 1 or 2 or 3 eggs, they laid 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 eggs in a nest. And so what that male is doing by bringing in all this prey is he's conveying to the female, don't stop at 4, baby. Keep them coming. Keep them coming. And so all of those chicks hatched, and all of those young birds, there's some baby face only a mother could love. All of those young snowy owls, come November and December and January that winter, they came south. There's this long-standing myth about snowy owls that they come south from the Arctic because there's no food and they're starving to death. And in fact, these big invasions, these big eruptions, are generally young birds that are as fat as a bird can be. They're in extraordinarily good winter physical condition. And so we launched Project Snowstorm, and that's what my plant back here in the audience was referring to. And this is a collaborative project. There's now probably about 40 or 45 of us, researchers, banders, wildlife veterinarians, wildlife pathologists, across the Great Lakes and the Northeast, southern Canada, the Great Lakes, or the Great Plains, that are studying the winter ecology of snowy owls. We actually know more about the lives of snowy owls up on their Arctic breeding range than we do about how they live when they come down here in these winter eruptions. And this is a species that is arguably one of the 2 or 3 at greatest and most immediate risk from climate change because of where they breed and what they depend on the high Arctic. As the climate is changing the Arctic, these lemming cycles are starting to flatten out and disappear, and that's bad news for the snowy owl. So we need to know as much as we can about them. So what we've done over the last couple of years is we've harnessed 2 technologies that most of you probably have in your pocket right now in your phone. We use GPS GSM transmitters that communicate with they're solar power transmitter. You can see one in the middle of that owl's back. They weigh only about 3% of the owl's body weight, so it doesn't weigh the owl down. And it communicates continuously with the GPS satellites overhead, and it's continuously logging incredibly accurate three-dimensional GPS locations, latitude, longitude, and altitude. So if they're migrating, we know how high they're flying. And then about once a week or so, whatever we have it programmed for, it dials up through the cell phone network and it sends us a text message with all the data. So basically, I get text messages from snowy owls, which is pretty cool. And we've put 43 of these transmitters on snowy owls in 10 states from North Dakota to Maine over the last 3 years. We're also taking blood and tissue and feather samples from the owls that we're catching, and we're looking at the DNA, we're looking at the chemical isotopes in the feathers that tell us where in the Arctic these birds are coming from, how their diets change. We're working with a whole large group of wildlife veterinarians and pathologists and salvaging as many dead snowy owls as we can, because snowy owls come down from the Arctic and they don't know from humans at all. They don't know cars, they don't know planes, they don't know high tension wires. They get in a lot of trouble down here. And so, during these big eruptions, sometimes hundreds and hundreds of snowy owls are killed by, they get hit by planes at Philadelphia Airport, they get hit by cars, they get electrocuted. And so we're necropsying all of those snowy owls just to find out what condition they're in, what kind of diseases are they carrying. We're looking at their toxicology results. Are they picking up anticoagulant rat poisons? We found out, to our surprise, snowy owls aren't picking up as much rat poison as we thought. What they are exposed to at really high, surprising levels is mercury, which is a really nasty environmental toxin. It's produced mostly from coal-fired power plants. It gets into the food chain. It bioaccumulates up the food chain the way DDT used to do. And at high enough levels, it interferes with reproduction, and it can interfere with behavior. And we're actually starting to wonder if some of these snowy owls that get themselves in trouble, that have really high mercury levels, that their behavior is actually compromised. Basically, the Mad Hatter and Alice, mercury poisoning. It can make them do dumb things, including like maybe fly in front of cars and planes. So that's one of the things that we're really focusing on right now. We asked photographers across the country to send us photographs of snowy owls with their wings and tails open, because we can age and sex the birds by the feather replacement pattern and the pattern of spots and bars on the birds, and figure out where the males and the females and the juveniles and the adults are. The one thing we didn't have when we launched this project was a budget, because literally on December 6th, 2013, I thought I was going to be spending a quiet winter finishing my book, which was already overdue. On December 7th, I got a call from a friend of mine who's a colleague of mine in Maryland who's been studying owls, who said, "Hey, are you paying attention to what's going on with these snowy owls? We need to do something." Later that day, I got a call from a former research technician of mine who now works for the company that makes those transmitters, who said, "Hey, we've got some transmitters here, and we'll give them to you at cost. If we can, if you can just cover our costs." These things are like $5,000 a piece. They gave us about a $2,000 savings on each one. 3 years later, after 43 transmitters, they're still doing that. So what we ended up doing was throwing an online pledge drive, basically, through Indiegogo. We crowdfunded this. And we raised about $72,000 that year in small contributions from individuals and also sponsorships from organizations like the Pennsylvania Society for Ornithology that sponsored, like they gave us $3,000 to put a transmitter on an owl in Pennsylvania so we could track that bird. And that's what we've been doing for the last 3 years. These, just to give you a sense of how many people and organizations are involved in Project Snowstorm, this does not include the literally thousands of people who've made donations to Project Snowstorm. Not a person involved in this organization and this collaboration takes a dime out of it. We're all volunteers. We're all doing this because we're passionate about it. It's been incredible. Of course, you have to catch your snowy owl first, and that's one of these big bow nets that I was talking about. And we use a live lure bird, in this case a pigeon, with a special leather-lined or a double layer leather flak jacket, basically, made by me. I'm the tailor to the stars here. And I'm not suggesting it's the high point of the pigeon's day, but but injuries on the pigeons are actually fairly rare. And we're trying to catch a bird that has 8 times the visual acuity of a human, and we actually have to have them come in and land quietly and pull their wings in on this trap before we can trigger the trap. So it's not like a duck decoy. We just have to get them in shotgun range. It is a very exciting thing. I've had the worst case of buck fever that I've had in a long time trying to catch snowy owls, especially if you're sitting out on the tarmac at Philadelphia International Airport with 737s landing, 30 or 40 feet away from you, trying to catch a snowy owl with folks from the USDA's Wildlife Services Department. So once we catch the owl, we take a bunch of measurements. This is a close-up of what one of the transmitters looks like. That we put them on with a harness made out of woven tubular Teflon, which is wonderful stuff because it doesn't rub and it doesn't chafe and it's very smooth. And the only place in the world that makes the tubular Teflon ribbon that every raptor researcher in the world uses is Bally Ribbon Works in Berks County. And it has medical applications as well. And I hesitate to tell you the story, but I will anyway. 2 winters ago, I had a deviated septum fixed. And my doctor, who's a wonderful old guy, he's 84 years old, got off the boat from Italy years ago and still sounds like it. And Dr. Toso said, I put a piece of plastic up in your nose, and you got to come back in tomorrow. And I pull the plastic, just a little piece of plastic. It just helped. And so, I wake up from the operation, and I've got this like silk thread hanging out of my nose. And the next day, I go into his office. And he reaches up into my nose and he yanks out an 8-inch long piece of this stuff, exactly the same stuff. And I'm trying to explain to him that this is the same stuff that we use to study snowy owls. He was not as impressed by that as I thought he should be. So anyway, the transmitter sits in the middle of the bird's back. It's going to be on the bird for life. It's solar powered. Other colleagues of ours have been using these transmitters on golden eagles that have been out there for 8, 9, 10 years. You get a tremendous amount of information from them. And then the owl goes back to doing what it does. And you get these just incredibly precise locations. And I think it's fair to say every single snowy owl that we have put a transmitter on has surprised us, including the very first one. Because snowy owls eat lemmings, right? They eat mammals. They eat rodents. We expected these birds. The one we trapped initially was on the coast of Maryland at Assateague Island. We figured, it's going to be hunting, rice rats and meadow voles and rabbits up in the uplands. And instead, that bird spent all of its time at night out over open water. It moved around Delaware Bay. It's near Reeds Beach, New Jersey, where that map was taken. It was doing all of its hunting at night out over open water, picking off water birds, feeding on ducks and geese and gulls and loons and grebes and things like that. And that explains these, I think, in part, these really high mercury levels we're seeing, because mercury bioaccumulates mostly through aquatic food chains. And so one of the things we're looking at now is studying the movements of and looking at the comparative mercury levels in birds that are in coastal Atlantic environments like this versus coastal inland environments where they are doing all of their hunting on land, because some of them hunt strictly mammals. They're very individual that way. Versus birds in the Great Lakes, because mercury levels are higher in freshwater systems than marine systems. And this has really opened a window on these birds. But there have been so many surprises. So I'm going to stand up for a second. So this was that same, what's that? Oh, I can take that microphone. Okay, so this was that same bird. Later in the winter, he moved up along the coast of New Jersey. And in this map, anything in red is in the daytime and anything at night is blue. And you can see that mostly in the daytime, he's just sitting on these little islands out in the bay. And at night, flying around and hunting for, getting up and going, I think I'll have maybe I'll have a scalp tonight. And later in the winter, this whole thing froze. But what really struck me early in the winter, there's this spot right here where the owl was stationary. And this was open water, and snowy owls do not float. And I zoomed in closer and closer in Google Earth, and finally when I zoomed in way down, I realized there's a channel marker under there. There's a buoy. So he'd take off, and he'd fly out at night, and he'd go, let's see, no, I had scalp last night. I'm going to have a brant tonight. they sit out there bobbing around looking. These guys are, in many respects, marine hunters. Some of them wandered tremendous distances. This is a bird we tagged, another one on the coast of Maryland. He went, all the way up through Pennsylvania, went up into around New Holland. He actually went right through Westchester, looped around, came back down, spent the rest of the winter right at the Wetlands Institute, for those of you who know your Jersey Shore, very close to Avalon. And then these two birds, two adult females, on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan 2 winters ago, and this is about a quarter mile right there. And this is the embodiment of that old Robert Frost line that good fences make good neighbors. They never trespassed on each other. The only time this owl went across that owl's territory was after that owl already went north. But if your neighbor weighs 6 pounds and has 8 razor-sharp talons at the end of her feet and has a bad temper, you do not trespass. All right, this one really threw us for a loop. This is a bird we tagged up in Erie, Pennsylvania, and the lake was frozen. And what you have to understand here, why this is so puzzling, is that all of these little square icons indicate a stationary location. And we looked at that and we thought, oh my God, he's walking to Canada. And actually, that's the Canadian border right there. And then the penny dropped. No, this is what happens when you have a stationary owl sitting on sheets of ice that are getting gently pushed along at about half a mile an hour by the wind. And then, and then eventually got bored and flew back to land. And in fact, this owl and another one that we tagged that winter spent almost the entire winter out on the ice in Lake Erie, in the middle of the lake, weeks at a time without coming to land. And that winter, Lake Erie was almost entirely frozen, 98.5% frozen. So we're thinking, what are they eating? Well, it's the 1.5% of the lake that wasn't frozen that makes the difference, because Lake Erie is, in the wintertime, even in a really cold winter, is huge plates of ice. And as the wind blows and shifts, those plates of ice, gaps in the ice open up and close, and in those gaps and those areas of open water, there are ducks and geese and gulls and other water birds, and that's what they were feeding on. Some of them were urban owls. This is one that we tagged at a small airport outside of Baltimore, put a transmitter on her, took her 50 miles west into the farmland of western Maryland and released her, and she flew right back into the heart of Baltimore. And we were collecting data on this owl. We were getting a location every 30 seconds. I mean, these transmitters are it was like a fire hose of data coming from this bird. This is what it looked like in Google Street View. We were collecting data so frequently and so quickly on this owl that it's not as accurate as it normally is. Usually, if I'm outside with a transmitter, you can tell the difference if I'm standing here or here. I mean, that's how it's fraction of a meter accuracy. At that rate of data collection, that's why it kind of looks like she's jumping around in the air, but she was sitting on top of the building. Now, I mentioned that, these owls get in trouble, and often when they come down here, the trouble they get into is connected to us. But, these are also, these are young birds, and bad things happen to young birds on their first migration. So this is Norman Smith. I mentioned Norman. He works for Massachusetts Audubon, and he's been studying snowy owls at Logan Airport, and that's a bird that he transported from Logan down to Cape Cod and released her with a transmitter. She flew out to Martha's Vineyard and spent the winter out on the vineyard and did just fine until the end of March, when she tried to fly across the open water of the bay in the wake of a huge nor'easter with hurricane force winds. And we don't know if a big wave came up and caught her or if the wind blew her down, but she drowned. And we had a second tagged owl the same night that drowned at Gloucester Harbor to the north, and we know of at least 4 or 5 other untagged snowy owls that were found washed up on beaches in the wake of that storm. All of them were young birds. Young birds make bad decisions sometimes. Whether we're talking about snowy owls or robins or hummingbirds or bald eagles, about 70% of birds don't make it to their first birthday. It's tough. It's tough being a bird. But the biggest danger for these owls when they come south is are humans. And I mentioned airports are a real problem. This was the first owl that I trapped at Philadelphia Airport. Jenny Smith, who used to be the Wildlife Services person there, was a tremendous help working on this project. It's her job to keep birds and planes away from each other. And so we trapped this owl, we put a transmitter on him, we took him out to New Holland in Lancaster County where there were lots of other snowy owls that winter. We released him, and the little sucker went right back to the airport. And he would spend the day mostly out here at the east end of the runways, and then at night he'd take off. Now the Delaware River is right here full of water birds. This guy was not a bird eater. He would take off and fly up and land right along I-95, especially in the median zone between I-90, north and southbound lanes of I-95, right by the airport, and hunt meadow voles and rats. And Jenny and I tried repeatedly to retrap him to get him back away from the airport, but unfortunately, the end of January that year, just before daybreak, he flew across the runway as a jet was taking off. And the point of impact was the transmitter. It broke every major bone in that bird's body. But it did not damage the plane, which I'm sure all the people on, well, it was a cargo jet, but still, there's a crew on there that would have had a really bad day if that owl had come through their windscreen at a couple hundred miles an hour. Incidentally, the transmitter kept working, even after that. They're rugged transmitters. In the spring, they start moving north, usually in late March or April. And once they get north of the cell phone network, we lose track of them because these transmitters communicate to us through the cell phone network. But they continue to log locations. They can store 12 years' worth of data. And when they come back south again, we get all of that data. And these are the tracks of some of our owls that have gone up into the northern Ungava Peninsula up here, which is where that big breeding event was. We've had a couple of them that have gone up here into northern Nunavut, up in the Boothia Peninsula. This is a bird that we trapped in Baltimore a couple of years ago. Caught him first as a young male in his first migration. Just banded him and let him go. We didn't have a transmitter that was the right size for him. He came back the next year as an adult male, and you see quite a difference in his plumage. Male snowy owls, generally speaking, tend to get whiter as they get older. We put a transmitter on him. This was 2 winters ago, and he went north. He spent most of the winter again along the coast of New Jersey. Started moving north. That just gives you a sense of his movements. Again, doing most of his hunting out over water. He's mostly a bird eater. Headed north, went right through New York, and I do mean he went right through New York. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he was perched on a 58-story skyscraper next to Madison Square Garden. That was the view that he had. And then from there, headed up the east side of James Bay and Hudson Bay and up into the Ungava Peninsula, and then he wasn't old enough to breed. He's 3 years old, but not old enough to breed yet. Spent the whole summer moving around. He traveled more than 3,000 kilometers, just kind of wandering around. It's kind of like a gap year for a snowy owl. And then came back south, and last winter he spent the winter at Amherst Island in Canada. I know we got to wrap things up here, but I want to just leave you with one last one. This is my favorite snowy owl track of all. This is a bird this is one of the birds that we trapped on Lake Erie that spent the summer or the winter out on the ice. He flew up to the southern edge of Hudson Bay and actually went out onto Hudson Bay. And when we got that track, we're like, okay. But then we realized this is what happens when you have a snowy owl sitting on an iceberg in Hudson Bay. And the wind and the tide are both going in the same direction, and then the tide turns against the wind and they don't go quite as far, and then the tide turns and the wind and the tide are going the same direction, and the wind shifts out of the south for a couple of days, and eventually the bird gets bored and flies back to land again. That's just so much fun. And so your innocent question set me up for this. www.projectsnowstorm.org. All of these maps are on there. We're going to start tagging more owls as soon as they come south this winter, and we would love to have you just follow along. It's the coolest research experience I've ever been involved in, and we're still learning a lot. Anybody have any questions about this? Yes.
I wanted to bring up the point. I was always leery about any kind of rodenticide or poison or anything like that, because if you get a poisoned mouse or a rat that gets out, something eats it, that thing's going to get poisoned too.
Yeah.
I found a natural deterrent for mice is mint. They can't stand the smell of mint. I got little cotton balls with some mint extract now, just cooking mint, put it behind my wall under my sink. Within seconds, the mice took off, they never came back. If you're not using poison, the mice stay away from your house.
So,
Do the same thing with cinnamon, it keeps ants out of your kitchen. Put cinnamon at the bottom of your door, they don't come in.
and I've heard the same thing from a number of other people using mint, putting cooking mint extract on cotton balls and sticking that around.
Now they have mint scented trash bags and they keep raccoons out of your trash cans. It works. One with Walmart.
That one, I hadn't heard about the raccoons. It just goes to show raccoons have absolutely no taste.
But it works. I tried it, it works.
Yes, ma'am.
Do all birds swivel their heads and how far can they go around?
Great question. Such a good question. So, how far can owls turn their head around? There's this notion that owls can turn their heads completely around. In fact, somebody told me when I was a kid, well, son, if you find an owl sitting in a tree, if you just walk around and around and around, eventually the owl's head will unscrew and fall off. And I'm like, really? They can't turn their head that far, but an owl can turn its head about 270 degrees. We can turn our head about 180. So, but they've got a lot more. They've got more vertebrae in their neck than we do, and they're much more flexible. And it's an advantage to them because, again, you don't want to tip off your prey. So the less movement you do, if you don't have to move your whole body, you just have to swivel your head around. But most birds have an unusually flexible neck, and in fact, most birds can turn their head almost as far as an owl can. It's just a whole lot more dramatic with an owl because usually they keep their body still and the whole head swivels. And you can't see the neck, so it looks like it's kind of like magic. Yeah. So, yes, sir.
I have a question about owl pellets and a brief technology observation. Part of my work includes finding working around the antenna towers. I see a lot of what I assume to be owl pellets. My question is, do all species of owls regurgitate their leftovers in the form of pellets, and do other species of raptors do that as well?
Right, so the question is, do all owls cast, they call that casting a pellet, regurgitating a pellet, and do other species of raptors do as well? Owls will regurgitate a pellet if they've eaten food that's got a lot of roughage that they can't digest. They don't have particularly strong gastric juices, so it doesn't dissolve those things. But if they're eating, for example, worms, and I've seen eastern screech owls come out after a rain and pick up earthworms, there's nothing hard in there, so they're not going to cast a pellet from that. But yeah, almost all owls, I really can't think of an exception of an owl casting a pellet. Now, if there are insectivorous owls, like flammulated owls in the northern Rockies that mostly eat insects, and if they're at a time of the year where they're eating mostly soft-bodied insects like moths, there's not really anything to come back up again. Other raptors like hawks, for example, will cast pellets, but not much because they have much stronger gastric juices. They also, many hawks tend to be much fussier eaters, and they don't eat quite as much roughage. But what they do tends to get digested. But it's not just hawks and owls and what we think of as raptors. Gulls cast pellets all the time. You'll find these if you walk along the beach. You'll find these little piles of it looks like somebody crushed up crab shells. And they're red, almost like you boiled the crab because of the gastric juices, and those are cast from gulls if they've been eating shellfish or if they've been eating crabs. Even some of the larger flycatchers will cast pellets, like great kiskadees that will eat large insects or occasionally eat frogs and small lizards, and they'll cough up and cast pellets. Crows and ravens will sometimes cast up pellets. So it just depends on what they've been eating. Yes. I'm not. So the question was about black vultures. I'm not aware of whether or not black vultures cast pellets or not. I've had vultures in captivity when I was doing rehab, and they just never seem to eat that much roughage. They're mostly eating organ meat and muscle meat. But I'm actually not sure. But does anybody know the answer to that?
Well, our vulture, we have a turkey vulture, a rehab turkey vulture at Briar Bush, and as far as I can tell, he doesn't cast any. Yeah, Ralph.
Okay.
He doesn't Ralph any pellets.
Oh, that's right. It's not casting is not the correct word. It's ralphing. Any others? Yes, ma'am.
Other than civilization, what are the enemies of owls?
Oh, that's a great question. So other than civilization, what are the enemies of owls? Mostly other owls, bigger owls. The northern saw-whet that I showed you that we've been studying for years, that's the smallest owl in the east, and everybody else eats them, including screech owls, which don't look that much bigger but weigh twice as much. Now, I don't know how common it is for screech owls to catch saw-whets, but we have had, over the years, on very rare occasions, screech owls come into our nets. This happened to us just the other night for the first time in many years. Screech owl came in and killed a saw-whet in the net. To put this in perspective, we've caught about 11,000 saw-whets over the year, and we've lost about a dozen to predator attacks in general. So it's not very common. But barred owls are death on small owls. They really key in on birds and in general. And in fact, in some areas, like, again, my friend Rob Beauregard's study in North Carolina, in suburban backyards in North Carolina, about 70% of a barred owl's diet is birds. They love cardinals. Screech owls love cardinals because cardinals come into the feeder. If you've ever had, they're the first bird in the morning when it's still kind of dim twilight. They're often one of the last ones feeding late in the day. Perfect time for a screech owl to be hunting. So, and then as far as other dangers, when they're nesting, raccoons are probably the single biggest danger. In wilder areas, fisher will take like great horned owls out of a nest. If a hawk can find one in the daytime, they'll take them, but that doesn't happen very often. There was a question. Yes, ma'am.
In general, do they see color at all?
Oh, great question. Do they see color? So far as we know, they don't seem to have particularly good color vision, which is unusual for birds. Most birds have exceptional color vision. But when you look at the rods and cones in an owl's eyes, rods give sensitivity to light, cones to color. They've got dramatically more rods than they have cones in their eyes. That's another reason they have a lot more rods than we do. It's another reason they have better night vision than we do. Yes, sir.
You were talking about the size of an owl's eye. Is that one of the reasons why their heads are so much?
Yes. Yes, that's a great point. The size of the eye limits the movement of the eye. That's why the owls are able to, it's one of the reasons owls move their heads so well. Yeah, and I should have, thank you for bringing this up because I didn't mention it before. Their eyes are so large that they're basically locked in their skull. No owl will ever look out of the corner of its eye at you. They're not shifty-eyed animals. And that's another, goes back to Mark's comment about them being wise. One of the reasons that we think owls are intelligent is because they're not looking out of the corner of your eye at you. They turn fully and look right at you. And we find that a subconscious sign of intelligence. And it's mostly just a function of they've got gigantic eyes in this otherwise really quite large skull.
At what distance then are their eyes focused? They're constantly set.
They're locked in place in their skull, but they can still change the focal length inside the eye. But
If you were to get too close to them, they don't be able to see out of one.
well, I mean, they've got binocular vision, and they're both facing forward. I mean, to be honest with you, I don't know what the minimum focus distance is. But I have seen, and I'm sure Mark has with captive owls. I have seen saw-whet owls. When a bug has walked in front of them, lean over and get their face down within about that far of the insect, looking. So presumably it's focusing at that distance. So, yeah. Question.
One quick question. If I want to put up some owl boxes, I have like almost 100-year-old maple tree, huge. Can I actually put a couple boxes in the one tree?
I wouldn't try to put, I wouldn't try to put multiple boxes in the same tree. I mean, you can. I don't think it's necessarily a deal breaker, but I'd put them on adjacent trees if you could, or put up a pole. You want to put the box up, 8 or 10 feet off the ground. It's ideally you want to put some sort of a predator guard around the tree so a raccoon can't climb up. Like a metal guard. It's easier just to put the box butts up in the tree.
I had a question that sort of dealt with the same question, but like question is, if I feed birds in the winter and I have owl boxes, aren't I just saying, hey, here's
So if you, in other words, if you're feeding, if you're putting up owl boxes and feeding birds in the winter, or you're just simply providing little feathered sacrificial victims for your owls? Probably not. And the reason for that, I mean, I mentioned screech owls taking cardinals at feeders. The fact is they take cardinals a lot because cardinals are active, regardless of whether there's a feeder or not, early in the day and late in the day. Scientists that have studied raptor predation at feeders have found that, generally speaking, a healthy bird has a better chance of avoiding a raptor at a feeder than it does elsewhere because there's more eyes watching. But raptors are more successful at feeders because that's where the sick, the halt, the lame, and the dying end up. You know, so it's often kind of the last lifeline for a bird that's diseased or ill or injured or something. It'll hang out at the feeder, and eventually the hawk will pick it off. And the same goes for owls. I wouldn't worry about it. I wouldn't. And also, the owls will help keep any rodents away at night that you don't know are coming into your feeder after dark.
Yeah. I know we've got a lot of questions still, but I want to respect the fact that he's not getting a lot of sleep lately with all the research. And I did want to mention we're having a trip from Briar Bush. It's going up to do some banding at the research station at Ned Smith. So take a look at that just in a couple weeks now. So
next Thursday, I think.
That's right.
Yeah.
Next week. So join Briar Bush if we have any space left. We're a little bit overbooked here, but I want to thank you very, very much, Scott, for coming.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you all for coming out this evening.
And just one last thing, Scott promised he would teach everyone to do a barred owl call before he left.
And I know we've got some very experienced birders here who are probably better at doing barred owls than me. And so I'll expect the choir to chime in here. I'm looking at you. So barred owls, a fairly big owl. And if you look at a field guide, the field guide will tell you that barred owls say, "Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all?" And it kind of sounds like this. Woo, 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 woo. So nobody gets out of this room, so you do a barred owl. So all together now. All right. Thank you very much.